The first conversation they had about it lasted approximately 90 seconds and established the terms under which both of them intended to conduct the arrangement, which were that it was an arrangement and nothing more, and that they were both people who had learned the hard way what happened when arrangements became more than arrangements, and that neither of them had any intention of repeating that particular lesson. Gideon Farr said his piece first because he had arranged the meeting with the Callaway Employment Exchange, and the meeting was at his kitchen table, and the house was his, and he said it in the way of a man who has been clear about something for long enough that the clarity has become automatic. He had been a widower for 3 years. His wife Ellen had not died so much as left, which was its own kind of loss, and one that the word widower did not cover. But widower was the word that the exchange used, and he used it too, because it was simpler than the truth, and the truth was his and not the exchange's business. Ellen had left in the second year of a difficult drought and a failed cattle season, and she had said, with the honesty that was both her best quality and in this instance her most devastating one, that she had not signed up for this kind of life and was not prepared to remain in it. He did not hold this against her in the way that bitterness holds things. He had understood, after a year of sitting with it, that the problem had not been who Ellen was, but who he had believed her to be, which was a person who had fully understood what she was choosing when she chose a ranch life and had chosen it anyway. She had chosen him and had not fully understood what came with him, and he had believed she understood because he had needed her to understand, and the believing had been his failure as much as anything else. That understanding had not made the leaving easier. It had made the aftermath more useful, which was a different and colder thing. He had learned from it what he intended to have learned from it, which was not to need someone to be something before he understood what they were, and not to offer someone a life without being sure they had looked at the life clearly before they accepted it, and not to put himself in the position of the person left behind again. The ranch was now in the best condition of its 12-year history, and none of that had changed what he had decided, which was that he was not going to give another person the power to make that kind of exit from his life. The cost of it was too specific and too known, so he said so. He said it plainly to the woman from the exchange, the housekeeper they had sent to manage the Farr place through the season, which was going to be a hard one because the North herd had developed a respiratory sickness, and the work of managing the sick animals and keeping the healthy ones separated was going to take all 3 hands plus him through November. And the house and the accounts and the kitchen were going to need someone. And he had taken on a housekeeper before with no incident, and he was taking one on now with no expectation of incident. And he said this was a working arrangement, and he wanted to be clear about that from the start, because clarity saved everyone time. The woman said she appreciated that very much, and she would like to be equally clear. Her name was Nora Vass, and she was 34, and she had been through the employment exchange twice before, with placements that had been fine in every way that mattered, and one way that had mattered differently and badly. The second placement, a widower on the South Range, who had been kind and attentive, and had made clear over the course of 4 months that his interest in her was not limited to the household, and she had managed that poorly by her own assessment, which was that she had let it go further than was wise, because it had been a long time since someone had been kind to her, and she had confused being ready to receive kindness with being ready to receive what came with it. What came with it was a man who had proposed marriage in the 5th month, and whose proposal had contained within it, when she looked at it carefully, a set of assumptions about what she would become and what she would give up and what the ranch would require from her that bore a stronger resemblance to the marriage she had left at 26 than she had understood until the proposal was in front of her. The marriage she had left at 26 had not been cruel. That was the difficulty of it. A cruel marriage would have been simpler to leave. What she had left was a kind marriage to a kind man who had not seen her, who had been genuinely fond of the version of her he had decided she was, and had kept being fond of that version while the actual her went somewhere. That version was not allowed to go, which was into her own opinions, and her own management of her own circumstances and her own competence applied to her own problems. She had managed the household and the accounts and the children, and had become, without deciding to, invisible inside the management of it, and when she had said so, he had been genuinely confused, because he had been kind to her, and generosity had been the form his kindness took, and he had not understood that generosity was not the same as seeing. So, when the proposal on the second placement had appeared, and she had recognized, in the language of it, the same architecture of a man who was kind and was proposing a category for her to fill, she had left, and the exchange had been understanding, and she had spent 4 months deciding what she actually wanted. And what she actually wanted was to manage her own circumstances with her own hands in her own head, and not to hand that management to another person, regardless of how kind they were, because kindness was not the same as seeing, and being seen was what she had needed and not gotten. So she said so. She said it in the same plain register he had used, and when she was finished, they looked at each other across the kitchen table, with the specific recognition of two people who have stated the same position from opposite sides of the same experience. And neither of them flinched from the recognition or softened it or added qualifications to make it more comfortable, because they were both people who believed that clarity at the beginning saved time and pain later, and the clarity at the beginning was this: two people who had learned not to expect more than what the arrangement described. Gideon Farr said good, and Nora Vass said good, and they began. The ranch, which had no opinion about what either of them had decided, and no particular interest in honoring personal policies established at kitchen tables in October, began immediately doing what ranches do during hard seasons, which was to require more than anyone had planned for, and to require it from everyone available. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live, and his. Two people who had learned their lessons well and were about to discover that a hard season on a working ranch does not negotiate with personal policy. If you want the next story the moment it lands, subscribe now. Then back to the ranch. The North Herd sickness was the first thing. She had not known anything about bovine respiratory disease before October, and she knew considerably more about it by the end of November. Because the nature of a hard season is that it teaches you what it teaches you whether you enrolled in the course or not. The sickness moved through the North Herd in waves, one animal down, then 3, then 2, recovering, while a fourth went sick, and the pattern of it required someone to track the individual animals, their symptoms and temperatures, and the sequence of exposure, in order to understand whether the treatments were working and in what order the herd could be safely reunified. That tracking was a record-keeping problem, and record-keeping was Nora's domain, and she brought it from the barn to the kitchen table on the third day without being asked. She had designed the tracking sheet herself, each animal by ear tag number, daily temperature, and symptom notation, treatment administered and response observed. The data organized so that Gideon and the hands could see at a glance which animals were improving and which were not, and what the pattern of the disease was doing. She set it on the table at supper and said she had been watching the pattern, and she thought the sickness was moving faster through the animals that had been in the northwest corner of the north pasture, and if that was right, it might be worth looking at the water source in that corner. Gideon looked at the tracking sheet. He looked at it for some time, the look of a man reading something that reorganizes his understanding of a problem he had been living inside for 3 weeks. Then he said the northwest corner had a seep that sometimes went brackish in the fall, and he had not thought about it in the context of the sickness. She said she had not known that, but it was consistent with the pattern. He went to look at the seep in the morning. It was brackish. He moved the affected animals away from it, and within a week, the new cases had dropped substantially, and the existing cases began to resolve in the order the tracking sheet predicted they would. The tracking sheet, by the third week, had become the document around which the entire North Herd management organized itself, not because Nora had insisted on it, but because Gideon and both hands had begun using it without discussion, which was the way something became authoritative on a working ranch, by becoming the thing everyone turned to when they needed to know what was happening. Ruiz, the foreman, came to Nora after the second week and said the sheet she had designed was the clearest piece of animal tracking he had seen in 30 years of cattle work, and she had said she would make him a copy if he wanted one for his own records, and he had said he would like that. And they had both understood something had shifted in the operation, and neither of them said so. Because what had shifted did not need saying. She noticed that Gideon had not thanked her. She noticed this the same way she had noticed the absence of the social sizing up on the first day as a difference from the expected. He had not thanked her because he had treated the tracking sheet as useful rather than as a gift, which was the distinction she had been waiting for without knowing she had been waiting for it. A man who thanked you was a man who saw you as supplemental. A man who used what you made without making it an occasion was a man who saw you as operational. Being operational, she found, was considerably more interesting than being thanked. The second thing was the account books. She had found them in the desk in the second week, which was when she always found the books, because the books were where the true picture lived, regardless of what anyone said the situation was. The Far Ranch books were in the condition she had not quite expected, which was good. Not organized the way she would organize them, and not formatted in the way that made the seasonal patterns most visible, but accurate and honest and clearly kept by a man who understood his own operation. There were no gaps and no creative interpretations and no entries that did not add up to what they claimed to add up to, which told her something about Gideon Farr that the first day in the kitchen had suggested, and the books confirmed, which was that he was a man who was honest with himself about his own situation. And that quality was rarer than competence and rarer than kindness, and was, she had concluded over 34 years, the one that mattered most. She reorganized the books by her own system in the third week and showed Gideon the reorganized version at supper, explaining the difference between his system and hers, and why she thought hers would show him more useful information, and she said the content was his and she had not changed any entries, only the organization, and he could revert to his original system if he preferred. He looked at the reorganized books for a long time. He looked at the way the seasonal patterns emerged from her formatting that had not been visible in his, and the way the cost columns related to the production figures in a way that the original layout had made harder to see, and she could see him reading the books differently than he had read them before, seeing the picture she had built from the same data he had been living inside, and the seeing of it reorganizing something in how he understood what the books had been telling him. He said he could see things in this version he had not been able to see before. She said that was the point of reorganization. He said she was right and she could keep the new system, and they both understood that he was not approving the system, he was accepting it, and the difference between those two things was considerable. Neither of them said anything else. But Gideon stayed at the table longer than usual that evening, and in the mornings that followed, he began to bring questions to the breakfast table that he had clearly been thinking about since the night before. And the questions were the questions of a man who had been looking at the reorganized books and seeing things he had not seen before and wanted to understand what he was seeing. And she answered them with the same direct precision she brought to everything, and the mornings began to have a quality they had not had in October, which was the quality of two people who were both thinking about the same thing. Tell me, when the ranch kept requiring them to work together, despite everything they had said on the first day, did you feel the nevers softening the way they softened? Not all at once, but one working morning at a time? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Now, back to the ranch. The third thing was the fence line collapse in December. The north pasture fence on the east side came down in a December storm. 3 sections of it, which was the fence that separated the recovering herd from the healthy herd, and the fence whose integrity was the single most important factor in whether the sickness rekindled in the healthy animals. It came down at night. Gideon was in the barn when it happened. Nora was in the kitchen, and the hand who discovered it came first to the barn and then to the kitchen simultaneously, because the problem was large enough to require more than one person's immediate attention. She was out of the kitchen and into the cold before she had thought about whether going was the right response, which told her something she had been not examining for 6 weeks. She came into the dark of the north pasture with a lamp and the wire pliers she had taken from the barn hook as she came through, and Gideon was already there with 2 of the hands, and they were assessing the damage in the way of men assessing a practical problem in the dark and the cold. And she came up beside him and held the lamp at the angle that gave the most light, and he took it from her without asking, and held it himself, and gave her the wire ends to hold while his hands worked, and they did not say anything to each other about the division of the task, because the task did not require speech. They worked for 2 hours in the December cold, and at the end of 2 hours the fence line was back, rough in places and not a permanent solution, but sound enough for the immediate purpose, and the herd was intact. She had wire cuts on her hands from the work, and her coat was going to need mending, and none of that registered until they were back inside, and the cold of the pasture began to leave her in the kitchen warmth. She made coffee, because there was nothing else sensible to do at midnight after a December fence repair. And Gideon sat at the table and rubbed his hands that had been in the wire and the cold for 2 hours, and she put the coffee in front of him, and he said thank you, and it was the first time he had thanked her for anything since the first day. And it was the thank you of someone saying something that included more than the surface of it, and she received it as such. She sat down across from him. They drank the coffee, in the silence that was familiar now from 6 weeks of evenings. The silence that had a shape and a quality, the silence that was not absence but presence, of the specific kind that accumulated between people who spent their days working at the same thing from different angles. The kitchen held them the way a kitchen holds people after hard, cold work, which is thoroughly and without requiring anything of them. He looked at the wire cuts on his hands and then at her. I need to say something. His voice had the particular quality she had come to understand as his version of a thing that had been decided. It is probably not what either of us intended to be saying at this point. He paused. I said, I would never remarry. I said it in this kitchen on the first day, and I meant it when I said it. He held her gaze. I have been meaning it a little less with every week that passes, and I think you should know that. She looked at the coffee cup. She thought about the second placement and the proposal that had contained assumptions she had not seen until they were in front of her. She thought about what it felt like to be seen versus what it felt like to be kind to, and about the specific quality of the past 6 weeks, which was that she had been asked questions, and her answers had been acted on, and the sickness tracking sheet had been used, and the books had been reorganized, and she had gone out into a December pasture with wire pliers without thinking about it, and she thought about the specific quality of what she had felt going through that door, which was not obligation, and was not duty, and was not something she had a word for yet, but that she recognized as different from both of those things. I said I would never trust again. She said it the way she said things that were important, looking at him directly, without managing the weight of it. I meant it when I said it. She paused. I have been meaning it a little less as well. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet about important things, which was a quiet with direction in it, rather than absence. Then he said he thought they should be honest about what a little less meant before either of them said anything further, because the honest version was the only version that was going to mean anything in the long run. And she said she thought so too. And they were honest, and it took the better part of another hour, and the coffee was cold by the end of it. What came out of the honest version was this. His never had been built on a woman who had left when the work was hard, and 6 weeks of watching a woman do the hard work from the inside had done something to the architecture of that never. Not dissolved it, changed what it was made of. The thing that Ellen had proven was that the wrong person would leave when the work was hard. What the past 6 weeks had been proving was different. Her never had been built on a man who had been kind to her without seeing her, and 6 weeks of being seen by a man who acted on what he saw had done something similar. Not dissolved it, changed what it was made of. The thing she had decided after the proposal was that kindness was not the same as seeing, and she had been right. What the past 6 weeks had been demonstrating was that the man across the table knew the difference too. Neither of them was proposing anything. They said so explicitly, because clarity had been the operating principle from the first day, and neither of them had any intention of abandoning it now. What they were saying was that the nevers were no longer what they had been, and that this was worth acknowledging, and that acknowledging it was not the same as acting on it, but it was the honest step between where they had been and wherever they were going, and they were both people who took honest steps, which was itself a thing they had learned about each other over the past 6 weeks, and which was itself a kind of evidence. Gideon cleared the coffee cups. She put the wire pliers back on the hook. They said good night in the way they had been saying good night for 6 weeks, which was with the particular quality of a good night that knows something has shifted and does not pretend otherwise, and the shift was named now, and the naming made it solid, and solid was what it needed to be for the next thing, which was January, which was the fourth thing. The fourth thing was Ruiz. Ruiz came to Nora in January with something he clearly wanted to tell Gideon, but had decided to tell her first, because in 6 weeks of watching the operation, she had become the person at the far ranch who received information and turned it into the form that was most useful for the person who needed to act on it. He said there was a man in Callaway named Drews who had been asking about the North Pasture water rights, asking in the specific way of a man who had a professional interest rather than a casual one, and that one of the hands had heard his name in connection with a land speculator who had been buying water rights along the range before leasing them back to the original owners at elevated rates. She had the documentation on the far water rights in front of her at the supper table that evening before Gideon came in from the afternoon check. She had pulled the deed file and the water rights certificate and the county water board registry entry, and she had organized them in the order that showed most clearly what was held and what the protections were and what vulnerabilities Drews might be looking for, and she had written a summary page in the manner she had developed for the herd tracking, clear and structured and usable by someone who had not read the underlying documents. She had also, while she was pulling the deed file, noticed the 2 places where the county registry entry did not fully match the deed language, and she had noted them on the summary page because they were the places where a challenge would come from if one came. And she had drafted a letter to the county water board requesting a clarification filing that would close both gaps. She had done all of this before Gideon came in, not because she had planned it that way, but because the problem had presented itself and she had responded to it, which was what she did, and she had stopped second-guessing whether responding to a problem that fell within her understanding was within her scope. Because the scope had been expanding since October in the natural way of a scope that meets a situation larger than the one it was defined for. Gideon came in and sat down, and she put the summary page and the draft letter in front of him. He read the summary page. He read the draft letter. He looked at her. "Ruiz told you." She said yes. She said she thought the water rights were sound, but the summary page showed 2 places where the county registry entry did not fully match the deed language, and those were where a challenge would come from if one came. And the letter she had drafted would request a clarification filing that closed both gaps. He read the summary page. Again he read the letter she had drafted again. Then he said she could send the letter, in the tone of a man who had stopped treating your contributions as things to be approved and had started treating them as things to be received, and she heard the difference and filed it with the other thing she had been filing since October. She sent the letter. The county water board confirmed the clarification within 3 weeks, and Drews did not appear at the far ranch or in any of the subsequent correspondence about the water rights, because the 2 places he had presumably been looking at had been closed before he had finished looking, and there was nothing left worth pursuing. By February, the north herd was fully recovered, and the fence line had been properly replaced, and the account books were in the reorganized system, and the water rights were clarified, and the hard season had been navigated. And neither of them had said anything further about the December conversation after the night of the December conversation, because neither of them was in a hurry, and the ranch had taught them both something about the value of not hurrying over the past 4 months, which was that the things that needed to arrive eventually arrived on their own schedule, and pushing them produced a different and less reliable thing. The ranch had had other plans from the beginning. That was what she understood on the February morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the window showing the first mild light of the year, and the herd back in the north pasture where it belonged, and the books on the shelf in her system, and the wire pliers on the hook by the back door where she had hung them on the night of the fence, 4 months ago now, and neither of them had moved them since. The ranch had known that 2 people moving in the same direction would find the same place eventually, and the same place was this kitchen, and this February morning, and the man across the table who had been reconsidering his never for 4 months and had arrived at the end of the reconsidering. It was a February morning, the first genuinely mild one, when Gideon came into the kitchen and sat down and looked at her across the table in the way he had been looking at her since December, which was the look of a man who had arrived and knew it and was ready to say so. She sat across from him and looked back in the way she had been looking at him since December, which was the look of a woman who had arrived at the same place and had been waiting to see if he was there yet. He was there. She could see that. Nora. Her name in his mouth, the first time with the full weight of it, the careful, deliberate first time, set down like something he had been holding and had decided to put on the table between them. Not the housekeeper's name, not the exchange placement's name, her name. She waited. He held her gaze steadily. I said I would never remarry. The ranch has been systematically dismantling that position since October. He paused. I would like to know if it has been doing the same to yours. She looked at the kitchen that had been hers for 4 months, the books on the shelf in her reorganized system, and the herd tracking sheets filed where they could be found, the wire pliers on the hook by the back door from habit. Now, rather than emergency, the coffee cup in her hand that poured itself in this kitchen without her having to decide. She looked at the man across the table who had read the tracking sheet and gone to check the seep, and acted on what he saw, and who had taken the lamp and given her the wire ends in the dark without discussion, and who had been honest with her in December, in the way of a person who believed the honest version was the only version worth having, and who had said she could send the letter in the tone of a man who had stopped needing to approve her conclusions. She thought about what she wanted. The ranch had made that question easier to answer than she had expected it to be. 4 months of being seen, specifically and consistently, in the manner of a person being recognized for what she was, rather than what was convenient, had answered it without her having to ask it, and the answer was here. This kitchen, this table, this February morning, this man. I'm not going anywhere. She put the words down the way she put down the summary pages, plainly and in the right order, in the register of a person who has checked the figure and is ready to stand behind it. She paused. The ranch has been doing the same to mine since October. She held his gaze. I would like to stay past the season, as if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. Gideon Farr. Her name for him, said the way a word sounds when it has found the place it was made for and is not going to leave it. He nodded once. The matter was closed, which was to say it was open, in the way that things that have been closed for too long are open when someone finally removes the latch, which is entirely, and with the particular quality of air that has been waiting to move. The February light came in through the kitchen window, and the north herd was back in the north pasture where it had been before October, and would remain now that the season was turning, and the books were in order, and the water rights were clarified, and neither of them had said never in some time. And the ranch had known from the beginning what they were going to find out eventually, which was that a hard season shared is a different kind of evidence than anything else. And the evidence had been building since October, and they were both people who acted on evidence. And here they were. He said I would never remarry, and she said I would never trust again. And the ranch had other plans, which is to say, the ranch had the plans it always had, which was the ordinary daily plan of a working operation that needed 2 people moving in the same direction, and did not particularly care what they had decided beforehand about the directions they were. And were not going to go. The nevers had been real. She needed to be clear about that, to herself and to anyone who asked. They had not been pretense or posture, or the kind of declaration that a person makes without meaning it. They had been the conclusions of 2 people who had been through the specific experience that produced that specific conclusion, and they had been as honest as any conclusion either of them had ever reached. The ranch had not proven the nevers wrong. It had provided evidence that the experiences the nevers were built on were not the only possible experiences, and that the architecture of a never could shift when the evidence shifted, and that this was not weakness or inconsistency, but exactly the thing that distinguished a person who was learning from a person who had stopped. They had both been learning since October. They had been learning what a hard season shared looked like, and what it felt like to have your thinking received rather than managed, and what it meant to work in the same direction from different positions and arrive at the same place. And the arriving was February, and the kitchen, and the coffee cup, and the wire pliers on the hook and each other across the table, and the nevers were retired, with the respect that something earned deserves when it has been outgrown. And the ranch was quiet in the particular way of a working ranch in February, when the hardest part of the season is behind it, and the next part has not yet begun, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the morning was theirs. He had said he would never remarry, and she had said she would never trust again, and the ranch had had other plans, which were not grand or romantic plans, but the ordinary plans of a place that required two people to keep it running and did not ask permission before requiring them. And the requirement had produced the evidence. And the evidence had done what evidence does when two people are honest enough to let it, which was change. The thing it was pointed at and what it changed was the nevers. And what came out of the changing was here. And here was enough and more than enough. And everything they had not known they were arriving at from the first day they sat across a kitchen table and said so plainly what they had decided. The ranch had known, even if they had not. It keeps its own accounts in its own system, compiled from the evidence of what two people do when a hard season requires them to do it together. And the bottom line, since October had been clear and consistent and entirely uninterested in what either of them had decided on the first morning at the kitchen table. Two people, one direction, one kitchen table. One clear February morning, no nevers whatsoever left standing, and all the mornings after it open and unencumbered, and entirely and completely theirs.